You ever notice how the truth becomes strangely complicated when the people hiding it are the ones who benefit from you never asking questions? Suddenly there are missing details, strange explanations, conversations that don't quite add up, and people who become uncomfortable the moment you look a little closer. Funny, isn't it? They tell you to stop overthinking, stop asking questions, stop digging, just trust them, just move on as if curiosity were some kind of crime. But maybe the problem was never that you were asking too many questions. Maybe you were finally asking the right ones, and when you start seeing patterns, you realize that not every mystery needs a dramatic conspiracy behind it. Sometimes people lie because they're afraid. Sometimes they hide things because they are ashamed. Sometimes they manipulate because honesty would cost them something. And sometimes you've simply been accepting an incomplete story because it was easier than confronting an uncomfortable truth. That's where your power begins, not in believing every suspicion, but in learning to separate evidence from imagination, facts from rumors, and intuition from fear. You don't need to accuse everyone around you. You need to become observant. Listen carefully. Watch behavior. Notice contradictions. Ask better questions. And most importantly, don't let anyone pressure you into abandoning your judgment just because your questions make them uncomfortable. The part they never wanted you to know may not be some shocking secret about them at all. It may be the truth about you. That you've been stronger than you realized, more capable than they expected, and far less dependent on their approval than they wanted you to believe. While the old story falls apart piece by piece, you begin seeing why certain doors closed, why certain people disappeared, why certain conversations felt wrong, and why some of the things you blamed yourself for were never entirely yours to carry, leaving you with a different kind of clarity, the kind that doesn't need revenge, doesn't need drama, and doesn't need everyone to confess before you can finally move forward, because sometimes understanding the truth isn't about exposing somebody else. It's about finally seeing your own life without the fog they helped create. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy you want. Isn't it strange how easily people accept a story when it arrives wrapped in confidence, repetition, and just enough authority to make questioning it feel unnecessary? Because someone tells you what happened, someone else repeats it, another person adds their version, and before you know it, you've accepted the whole thing as truth, without ever asking the most dangerous little question of all. How do you actually know? That's how stories become reality in people's minds. Not because they're always true, but because they're repeated often enough that challenging them starts to feel uncomfortable. Maybe you've been told who you are, what you're capable of, what you should want, what you supposedly did wrong, why someone treated you badly, why an opportunity disappeared, or why you should never try something again, and you've carried that explanation around like a prison sentence, never stopping to inspect whether the evidence actually supports it. But questioning the story doesn't mean automatically believing the opposite. That's another trap. If someone says you're a failure, you don't become successful simply by deciding they're evil. If someone says they know exactly why something happened, you don't need to invent a completely different explanation just to feel better. You need to investigate. Look at the facts. Look at the timeline. Look at what was actually said and what was merely assumed. Look at what people did rather than what they claimed they intended to do. Because sometimes the truth is far less dramatic than the story you've been carrying, and sometimes it's more uncomfortable. Either way, reality is more useful than fantasy. You may discover that someone misunderstood you rather than deliberately betrayed you. You may discover that you made a mistake rather than being secretly sabotaged. You may discover that a relationship ended because two people changed rather than because one person was secretly plotting against the other. And you may discover that certain people genuinely did manipulate you, but even then, Understanding the facts is more powerful than creating a revenge fantasy around them. The point isn't to become suspicious of everyone. That's not intelligence, that's exhaustion. The point is to become harder to fool without becoming impossible to trust. Listen carefully, but verify important claims. Accept advice, but examine its source. Notice patterns, but don't turn every coincidence into evidence. Ask questions without assuming the answer before you ask them. That's a skill, and like every skill, it gets stronger with practice. When someone gives you a story, ask yourself what they know, what they assume, what they want you to believe, and what information might be missing. Not because everyone is secretly lying, but because every person sees events through their own perspective, memory, emotion, and interests. Even you do. That's the uncomfortable part. You are capable of misunderstanding your own story, too. Maybe you've spent years saying, "I can't do that," when the real problem was that you were afraid to fail. Maybe you've been telling yourself, "They ruined my life," when the truth is that they hurt you. But you still have choices about what happens next. Maybe you've been carrying someone else's judgment, as though it were a fact, when it was simply an opinion delivered with confidence. Once you start questioning those narratives, you don't necessarily become angrier. You become clearer. And clarity is dangerous to manipulation because a person who thinks carefully is much harder to push around with fear, guilt, rumors, or emotional pressure. You don't need to accept every accusation, but you don't need to reject every criticism either. Examine it. If there's truth in it, learn. If there's no evidence, release it. If the situation is unclear, admit that you don't know yet. That sentence alone can protect you from countless bad decisions, because pretending to know what you don't know is one of the easiest ways to become trapped inside somebody else's story. Let facts earn your belief. Let time reveal patterns. Let behavior provide context. And when the story you've believed for years finally cracks, don't panic just because the old explanation is disappearing, because sometimes losing an old story is exactly what creates room for a more honest one where you aren't the helpless character everyone else gets to define, one where you can acknowledge mistakes without becoming your mistakes, recognize betrayal without becoming consumed by it, and accept uncertainty without inventing answers, simply to make the silence uncomfortable. While you keep questioning, observing, learning, and separating what is known from what is merely claimed, because the moment you stop accepting every story handed to you and start examining reality for yourself, you begin taking back something far more valuable than an argument. You begin taking back control of your own understanding. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy you want. The human mind has a nasty little habit of filling empty spaces with whatever explanation feels convincing, especially when the truth is incomplete, because uncertainty makes people uncomfortable, and a confident story feels much safer than saying, "I don't know," even when that story has absolutely nothing holding it together. And that's where assumptions begin. One small guess becoming another, until suddenly you've built an entire reality out of pieces you never actually verified. Someone doesn't reply to your message and you assume they're angry. Somebody looks at you strangely and you assume they dislike you. An opportunity disappears and you assume someone sabotaged you. A friend becomes distant and you decide they must be talking behind your back. And before you know it, you're reacting to a story created inside your own head, rather than responding to facts in front of you. Which is why learning to separate truth from assumption is one of the most valuable forms of mental discipline you can develop. Because truth doesn't become true, simply because you feel it strongly. And suspicion isn't evidence, just because your intuition feels powerful. Sometimes intuition is useful, because your brain has noticed subtle patterns you haven't consciously processed yet. But intuition can also be shaped by fear, past experiences, insecurity, exhaustion, and expectation, which means it deserves attention but not automatic obedience. And that's an important distinction, because you can say, "Something feels wrong," without immediately declaring, "I know exactly what happened," while facts answer questions such as what was actually said, what was actually done when it happened, who witnessed it, and what evidence exists. Assumptions answer questions that haven't been proven, why someone did something, what they're secretly thinking, what they will supposedly do next, or what hidden motive must explain their behavior. And the danger comes when we confuse those categories, because once an assumption becomes emotionally attached to us, we start looking for evidence that confirms it while ignoring anything that challenges it, turning our mind into a courtroom where the verdict was decided before the trial began. And suddenly every coincidence becomes proof, every disagreement becomes confirmation, and every neutral action becomes part of the story, while the possibility that we might be wrong becomes almost impossible to tolerate. But intellectual strength requires something much less glamorous: the ability to pause and admit uncertainty, to say, "This is what I know, this is what I suspect, and this is what I still need to find out," because those three categories are not the same, and keeping them separate protects you from unnecessary fear, anger, and conflict, especially when dealing with relationships, work, money, or decisions that can have serious consequences, because acting on an assumption can create the very problem you were afraid of. You accuse someone of betrayal, they become defensive, communication collapses, and now the relationship is damaged, partly because of something you never actually confirmed. While the mind tells you that your reaction was justified because the outcome looks like evidence, when in reality your assumption helped create the situation. And that's why slowing down matters. Ask questions instead of constructing conclusions. Seek direct information when appropriate. Compare multiple sources when something important is at stake. And give yourself permission to change your interpretation when new facts appear. Because changing your mind after receiving better information isn't weakness. It's evidence that your thinking works. While refusing to update your beliefs simply to protect your ego is how people become prisoners of their own narratives. And you don't need to become cold or skeptical of everything. You simply need to become precise, trusting when trust is reasonable, cautious when caution is justified, and uncertain when the evidence doesn't support certainty. Because reality doesn't owe you a satisfying explanation immediately. Sometimes the answer arrives later. Sometimes the answer is complicated. And sometimes you'll never know exactly why another person behaved the way they did. But you can still decide how you will behave without inventing a secret motive to make the uncertainty disappear. And that is a form of freedom. Because when you stop demanding certainty where certainty isn't available, you become less vulnerable to rumors, manipulation, emotional reactions, and your own imagination, allowing you to investigate instead of panic, observe instead of accuse, and respond instead of react. While other people may insist that their interpretation is the only possible explanation, you can remain calm enough to ask what supports it, what contradicts it, and what information is missing, because the goal isn't to win the most convincing story. The goal is to get as close to reality as possible, even when reality is less dramatic than the story you wanted to believe. And once you develop that habit, you begin making decisions from evidence rather than emotional guesses, protecting your peace without becoming paranoid, protecting your relationships without becoming naive, and protecting your future without allowing fear to write the story for you. While you continue learning to distinguish what happened from what you think happened, what you know from what you suspect, and what you fear from what you can actually prove, because the mind becomes much harder to manipulate when it learns that not every unanswered question needs an invented answer. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy you want. Words are wonderfully cheap because anyone can produce them, and people can promise loyalty while behaving selfishly, promise respect while crossing boundaries, promise change while repeating the same behavior, and promise that everything is fine while their actions are quietly screaming the opposite. Which is why one of the most useful things you can learn is to stop treating words as the complete story, because words matter, but behavior gives them context. And when the two consistently contradict each other, pay attention to the behavior, not because everyone who makes a mistake is secretly manipulating you, but because patterns reveal more than isolated statements. Someone can genuinely care about you and still make a mistake. Someone can have good intentions and still behave badly. And someone can say the right thing while repeatedly doing the wrong thing. So the goal isn't to become suspicious of everyone. It's to become observant enough to notice consistency, because anybody can perform goodness for an afternoon. But character tends to reveal itself through repeated choices, when there is something to lose, when nobody is watching, when there is no applause, and when doing the right thing becomes inconvenient. Watch how someone treats people who cannot benefit them. Watch how they behave when they are frustrated. Watch whether they respect a boundary after you've clearly communicated it. Watch whether their apology is followed by changed behavior, or simply another cycle of the same mistake. Because an apology without change can become a reset button that allows the pattern to continue, while genuine accountability usually produces something visible, not perfection, but effort, correction, and consistency. And this applies to yourself too, because it's easy to believe your own intentions are enough. You can tell yourself you're disciplined, compassionate, brave, or committed, but eventually your daily behavior has to support the identity you're claiming. Otherwise, you're just writing a flattering biography that reality hasn't approved. And that's uncomfortable, because actions remove the luxury of pretending. If you say your health matters, but never make time for it, your schedule is telling a different story. If you say your goals matter, but consistently sacrifice them for distractions, your habits are answering the question for you. If you say you want peace, but repeatedly return to unnecessary conflict, your choices are revealing what you're actually prioritizing. While people may tell you exactly what you want to hear, don't ignore what they repeatedly show you, because behavior has a way of becoming difficult to fake over long periods, and that's where discernment becomes useful. You don't have to confront every contradiction dramatically. You don't have to announce that you've discovered someone's secret character, and you certainly don't need to become obsessed with analyzing every movement, because that isn't observation anymore. That's paranoia. Instead, look for meaningful patterns. Give people room to explain genuine mistakes, and then see whether their explanation matches what happens next. Because one bad day doesn't define a person, but repeated behavior after clear communication tells you something important, while someone who constantly says, "Trust me," but repeatedly gives you reasons not to, may be asking you to ignore your own experience. And that's where you need to become honest with yourself, because sometimes the hardest person to stop making excuses for is someone you desperately wanted to believe in. You may keep focusing on their promises because accepting their behavior would force you to make a difficult decision, and the mind would rather preserve hope than face disappointment. But reality becomes easier to navigate when you stop asking what someone could become and start paying attention to what they consistently choose to be right now, while still leaving room for genuine growth. Because people can change, but change has evidence, It appears through different decisions, different habits, different responses, and different patterns over time, not simply through emotional speeches made after consequences arrive. And once you understand that, you become less impressed by dramatic promises and more interested in quiet consistency. Someone who keeps their word when nobody is watching becomes more trustworthy than someone who gives beautiful speeches about loyalty. Someone who respects your boundaries without demanding praise becomes more valuable than someone who constantly announces how respectful they are. And someone who admits a mistake and actually changes becomes more credible than someone who blames everyone else while repeating the same behavior. Because actions don't need to shout, they accumulate, they create patterns, and those patterns eventually tell a story, allowing you to listen to words without being hypnotized by them, appreciate promises without depending entirely on them, and give trust based on demonstrated behavior rather than emotional performance. While you become better at watching what people consistently do, you also become better at watching yourself, because the same standard must apply in both directions, and that creates a deeper kind of honesty, the kind where your actions begin matching your values so closely that you no longer need to convince anyone, because your life is already providing the evidence. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy you want. There is a strange kind of punishment people give themselves without realizing it, carrying guilt for things they didn't cause, apologizing for things they didn't do, taking responsibility for emotions that belong to someone else, and spending years trying to repair situations they never broke in the first place, as if suffering long enough might somehow rewrite the past. And that's where you need to stop and ask a very uncomfortable question. Is this actually mine to carry? Because not every accusation is a responsibility, not every disappointment is your fault, and not every person's pain is something you are required to fix. You can care about someone without becoming responsible for their entire emotional world. You can acknowledge that your actions affected someone without accepting blame for things outside your control. And you can admit your mistakes without turning one mistake into an identity. Because there is a difference between accountability and self-punishment. Accountability says, I did something wrong, I will understand it, repair what I reasonably can, and change my behavior. While self-punishment says, I did something wrong, therefore I deserve to suffer forever. And the second one doesn't create growth, it creates a prison. While guilt can sometimes point toward something that needs correction, shame often tells you that you are the problem itself. And that distinction matters because if you believe you're fundamentally broken, you stop looking for solutions and start looking for punishment. You replay old conversations, imagine what you should have said, wonder how you could have acted differently, and mentally prosecute yourself long after everyone else has moved on. While some people may even encourage that guilt, because a person who feels permanently responsible is easier to control, easier to manipulate, and more likely to tolerate unfair treatment. But you don't have to accept that role. If someone is angry, you can listen without automatically assuming you're guilty. If someone is disappointed, you can acknowledge their feelings without promising to change your entire life to remove their discomfort. If someone chooses to leave, you can grieve without deciding that their departure proves you are unworthy. Because other people's choices contain information, but they are not always verdicts about your character. And sometimes relationships fail because people are incompatible. Sometimes opportunities disappear because circumstances change. Sometimes people misunderstand each other, and sometimes you genuinely make mistakes. But none of those realities require you to carry permanent emotional debt. While you learn to separate responsibility from misplaced guilt, You begin examining situations more honestly. What did I actually control? What did I influence? What did I fail to do? What did the other person choose? What circumstances were outside everyone's control? And what can I reasonably repair now? Those questions bring you back to reality. Because guilt becomes destructive when it ignores proportion, treating every negative outcome as proof that you are responsible for everything, while healthy accountability recognizes limits. You can apologize for your part without apologizing for someone else's. You can make amends without surrendering your dignity, and you can learn without constantly reopening the wound. Because the past cannot be edited, only understood, and your job isn't to become the perfect person who never makes another mistake. That's impossible. Your job is to become more aware, more responsible, and more capable of making better choices next time. While people may remind you of who you were, because it gives them leverage over who you are now, you don't have to deny your past. But you don't have to live inside it either. You can say, "Yes, I made that mistake," without adding, "Therefore I deserve every bad thing that happens to me," because those statements are not connected. And once you break that connection, you create room for growth, forgiveness, and a healthier understanding of yourself. While you stop carrying every accusation as truth, you can start asking whether the criticism is fair, whether the evidence supports it, whether the expectation is reasonable, and whether there is anything useful you can actually do about it. And if there is, do it. If there isn't, release it. Because carrying something you cannot change doesn't demonstrate loyalty or morality. It simply drains the energy you could use to improve what is still within your reach. While you continue becoming more selective about what you accept responsibility for, you may discover that some of the weight you've been carrying wasn't placed there by reality at all. It was placed there by fear, guilt, people-pleasing, old conditioning, or the desperate desire to keep everyone satisfied, and eventually you begin putting some of that weight down, not because you stopped caring, but because you finally understand that caring doesn't require self-destruction, and responsibility doesn't require permanent punishment, allowing you to repair what belongs to you, return what belongs to others, and leave behind the burdens that were never yours to carry in the first place. I can't reproduce the exact voice of that character, but I can keep the dark, cynical, psychologically intense energy you want. Truth is a strange thing, because people often say they want it, but what they really want is a version of the truth that makes them feel comfortable. A version where they were completely right, the other person was completely wrong. Every painful event had a simple explanation, and the ending somehow proves they were the hero all along. But real truth doesn't always behave so politely. Sometimes it tells you that someone hurt you and you still made mistakes. Sometimes it shows you that you trusted the wrong person. Sometimes it reveals that you ignored warning signs because you wanted something to work. And sometimes it forces you to admit that the story you've been repeating for years wasn't entirely accurate. And that's uncomfortable. But discomfort isn't always destruction. Sometimes it's the beginning of clarity, because once you know what actually happened, you finally have something solid to build from. Instead of constantly fighting ghosts created by assumptions, rumors, regrets, and imaginary conversations, while some people become addicted to proving that they were betrayed, misunderstood, or treated unfairly, you can choose something more useful, understanding what happened and deciding what you will do differently now, because truth without action can become another form of entertainment. You discover something painful, talk about it endlessly, analyze every detail, replay every conversation, and then continue living exactly the same way, still trusting the same patterns, still ignoring the same warning signs, still allowing the same behavior, which means you learned the story but not the lesson. And that's the part that matters. Because the purpose of clarity isn't to give you better ammunition for an argument. It's to give you better direction for your future. If someone betrayed your trust, learn how you will recognize similar behavior next time. If you ignored your own boundaries, learn why you did it. If you made a mistake, understand what created it, and change the process that allowed it. If you were manipulated, learn the pressure points that made you vulnerable. Not so you can become cold and suspicious of everyone, but so you can become more discerning, because wisdom isn't becoming incapable of trusting people. It's learning how to trust without abandoning your judgment. While you uncover uncomfortable truths about your past, resist the temptation to turn them into weapons. Because revenge can feel powerful while secretly keeping you emotionally attached to the person or situation you're trying to escape. You may think you're punishing them, but if they still control your mood, your thoughts, your schedule, and your decisions, they still occupy far too much space in your life. And that's why moving forward requires something more difficult than revenge. It requires release. Not pretending that nothing happened, not excusing harmful behavior, and not denying your pain, but refusing to let the past become the permanent manager of your future. While you learn the truth, ask what it teaches you, what boundary needs strengthening, what habit needs changing, what relationship needs reevaluating, what expectation needs adjusting, and what part of your identity needs to be rebuilt without the old story attached to it, because you are allowed to become wiser without becoming bitter, more careful without becoming paranoid, stronger without becoming cruel, and more independent without becoming isolated. While other people may never confess everything you believe they should confess, you may never receive the perfect apology, and you may never get a satisfying explanation for every unanswered question, but your healing and growth cannot depend entirely on somebody else finally saying the words you wanted to hear, because that gives them control over a future they no longer deserve to influence. And sometimes closure is not a conversation. Sometimes closure is the moment you understand enough to stop repeating the same pattern. While you move forward, don't waste your energy trying to make everyone agree with your version of events, especially when the evidence is complicated, because your goal is not to win a courtroom inside your head. Your goal is to live better because you learned something real, and that means accepting nuance, acknowledging your own mistakes, recognizing other people's responsibility, and refusing to carry guilt that doesn't belong to you. While the past remains part of your story, it doesn't have to remain the author of every chapter that comes next, because you can take the lesson without carrying the entire wound, take the wisdom without preserving the resentment, and remember what happened without rebuilding your identity around it, and eventually the truth becomes less like a weapon and more like a compass, pointing toward better decisions, healthier relationships, stronger boundaries, and a future where you aren't constantly reacting to what happened before. Because the greatest use of truth isn't proving who was wrong. It's becoming someone who knows what to do with the truth once they finally have it.